Good afternoon. Today, I have my guest here, retired sergeant from the Philadelphia Police Department and the chief of second alarmers, Greg Masi, and Thomas Ryder, one of the board members of Fireman's Hall Museum Historical Corporation, and also retired chief from Burlington City Fire Department. He was one of very few people that was ever named honorary chief of Philadelphia by Commissioner Olshaver in 1991. Thank you guys for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. Our pleasure.
If anyone caught the TV show, The Curator's Corner, we talked a little bit about the Fire Reserve, and that's what this discussion will be about today. Obviously, the Philadelphia Fire Department was formed in 1871, went from the volunteer era to paid. And a lot of people don't understand that in 1942, due to the void of members from the department being drafted in the Second World War, they formed a group called the Fire Reserve Force that helped with these voids and with the members of the department, both to bring equipment and aid and work that was done on the fire ground. So starting off, Chief Masi, could you tell us a little bit about the Fire Reserve and how it originated?
Sure. I mean, you summed it up pretty well, Brian. I mean, that war era there really, I think across the country, not just Philadelphia, every major city had a void in recruiting firefighters, and they had to come up with an auxiliary force, or as they said in Philadelphia, the Reserve Fire Force. I said my exposure came to it in 1973 when I became a member. And it was I'll tell you what, in that time frame, you look back now, it was probably one of the best highlights of my life. Met a lot of nice individuals in the department who rose through the ranks. And in that, what they call the war years, a lot of extra alarm fires that were prevalent across major cities, including Philadelphia. Philadelphia was up there every year with 100+ extra alarm fires, which are kind of rare in these days.
Wow. Well, when you talk about meeting some of the friendships you founded in the Fire Reserves, and then later those guys came on to be Philadelphia firemen, can you tell me a few of those names that we all may be able to relate to? Sure.
I believe, Brian, last month you had one of them on your the Gulf Fire expose, which was great. Was a retired Chief Bob Marcasello. He was in the reserves. He had just left prior to my joining the organization, but I also was in there with just recently retired Charles Klink, retired as a battalion chief. And to this day, Charlie and I reflect back on that time period on our life, and he actually says, he goes, Chief, believe it or not, these people would not believe what we saw in that time frame. As you're right, it was just another era. And across all major cities at that time, a lot of old industry was, just as prone to extra alarm fires, and we did see a lot.
Right. Tom, can you tell us a little bit about how your connection with the Fire Reserve was?
Well, my father went on in 1965, and he had left right prior to Chief Masi coming on due to a heart attack. And but as a youngster, especially during the summertime, school was closed. Tuesday nights were the meeting nights at the reserves and training they had. So he would, I would ride down with my dad down to Engine 15's old house, Howard Street, Columbia Avenue, which was Engine 81, the reserves. And, I was allowed to sit in on the meetings, Chief Proudman and all the, the officers and whatnot. And then whatever training was going on, just used to sit back and observe that and whatnot. And a few times they would go out driver training, primarily for the pumper. A few times it was on Delaware Avenue drafting with the old auto car pumper. And I remember being down there a few times, and there was a lot of, I guess they bent the rules maybe, for me. I guess they did. I'm looking at, 12, 13, 14 years old, where I went to the thrill show, and given a helmet, and a coat, and the boots, and blended in, and it was really great memories there. I learned a lot from those guys at the training sessions, and that exposure helped me progress in my career forward with the fire department. And it was it was a lot of fun, and made some big fires back in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a lot of good exposure, a lot of good training, a lot of good memories. Yeah.
Chief, if you could tell us, how was the selection made of the personnel, and who gave the authorization of that?
Well, I believe, Brian, when I remember, if I can recall correctly, you submitted an application like any other organization, and I believe it was sent down to the department, to headquarters at the 1328 race. And there was a vetting process. I guess they did a background check, as any other organization would do. And then you would get notified to report to the station for an orientation. And once you're in orientation, training was commenced. As Tom would say, we did some training at the station. I actually had a chance to go up to Ridge and Cinnaminson at the old fire school. Did a little some training there. And then a lot of it was like, I guess, OJT, on the street, driver training. And some of those times we were out there actually driver training, and we would just be lucky enough to actually catch a job. We'd come across a job, and we would call it in, and we would actually assist the pay department when they came in, going into a firefighting tactics.
Tom, do you remember when your father was doing the training for the fire reserves? And do you remember what day of the week that was, or how long that went on for?
I think it didn't go on, if memory serves me right, it wasn't, it wasn't as long as, the fire college at the time. I know it was on Tuesday nights they would meet, and that was the training, and that would go from, I guess, that would be for a few hours, whatnot, as far as whether it was driver training or in-house training, as far as learning the the different, especially with ropes, tying, knot tying, and recognizing couplings, and all the different aspects that like a mini course, I guess. He was I would say that probably went on, maybe, I guess, for a couple months. No, excuse me, not a couple months. I would think probably I don't know, maybe a couple months. It's possible, in weeks, in fashion, maybe 6 weeks or something like that, to give people the basic knowledge, of what's expected of them on the fire grounds and whatnot. And the rules and regulations, they pretty much follow the same as the actual fire department too, because you were part of the fire department. So, they expected you to, carry your weight in good fashion, which, worked out good. Yeah.
Chief, where were some of the locations of the fire reserve, and was it actually the same culture as our department? Were members there staying overnight, or how did they work as far as duty time?
Yeah, well, when I joined the organization, the station was at Howard and Columbia, which is SN15's old station. And of course, I can remember back the station being at now where Fireman's Hall is located at 2nd Street. And I remember when I joined, and it was all based, there was no kind of commitment, how many hours you would put in. They would expect you to respond to a 2-alarm fire. But at the Howard and Columbia location, I remember in the front bedroom of the 2nd floor, there was at least 8 bunks. So a lot of members would stay over, and sure enough, it was back at that time, it was a pretty commonplace where if you were sleeping over at the station, that we were going to catch a run, an extra alarm fire. And most of the times you would respond in your private vehicle to the fire location. But there were those rare occasions where they requested our apparatus to respond to an actual extra alarm fire.
Okay. Now those guys responded in their personal vehicle. did they have certain placards that identified who they were, that they were with the Fire Reserve?
You know what? I remember, Brian, recalling at the time, I remember I had like a kind of a plaque or car plate I would put in my dashboard just so if I parked illegally on a fire ground, I wouldn't get a ticket from the police department. But there was no, we didn't have, not like we have volunteers outside in the counties, no warning lights in your vehicles. That was prohibited. But you would just drive to scene, park your car, and then try to find your officer from the reserves. And then you would get your marching orders from him where to deploy personnel at to help assist the department.
So our new audience that's just joining us, that's not familiar with this, can you explain to them what the call sign was for the Fire Reserve and what type of apparatus or vehicles that they rode in?
So yeah, in the department, the nomenclature was Engine 81. And when I first came in, my first experience was a 1955 Mack open cab pumper. So you heard the terminology. If you had never been on the back step, that's a totally different nomenclature. I mean, we literally stood on the back step of the apparatus while we were out there, either driver training or responding, and the actual officer and driver being the cab. So if you had inclement weather, it was raining, you were going to get wet. And that's the way it was back then. And if we had a lot of people, then we had to take the apparatus to an actual fire. Someone would stand on the back step and the rest would climb up in the hose bed. And at the time we had, of course, 10 helmets. So some had chin straps, but most didn't. So you had to hang on your helmet when you responded so it wouldn't blow off your head because they weren't really heavy like the helmets we use today.
Wow. And Tom, you said when your father was active, they still had the auto car at that time, which we still have one auto car left that's, I think, is at the shop at 26 and Master.
Yes.
Is that
Yes. Yes, that was it was a 49 auto car, and I guess you would call him maybe their chief driver or chief engineer was the name of it. I remember him was Phil Davidson. I don't know if Greg remembers him or not.
I recall him, yes.
Okay, and he was more or less oversaw that and took care of that like it was his own little baby, and that was the the pride of the fleet, and usually when they would have the thrill show or they would go on different circuses that came in. I remember going a few times when they had circuses in town. The James E. Straight's show was a circus that used to come into town. And the reserves would go there just more or less as a safety aspect as far as if, there was a small little fire broke out or something. So they would be assigned 2 pieces that night. And but the auto car was their it was their primary piece. Yeah.
Okay. Chief, what was the nature in which the Fire Reserve would be dispatched or called, and what may have been the duties on the fire ground once you arrived?
So when an extra alarm fire was struck out by the department, most members at that time had a tunable radio. It wasn't really a scanner at the time. Scanners came in the 70s, but if you heard it was a second alarm, you knew that you were going to report right to the incident scene. But every officer had so many members under his command. So the officer's obligation was that when a 2-alarm fire was struck, the officer would have to get in a call list and call them individually, at their home, because cell phones were not really a big thing back then in the 70s. So you actually had to call them at your house. So if you weren't home, you may have missed the call from the officer. Once the officer called, then you would report to the scene and find your officer or another officer who was there. And at that point there, our main primary mission was to help the responding company stretch in their hose lines and any other equipment need to set up around a fire incident scene.
Right. Once you guys got established, there were actually times where the reserve might have found themselves actually helping in firefighting or helping bring injured personnel out. Can you talk a little bit about that, Chief, and maybe some personal experiences that you had happened during that time?
Sure. I know last month the Gulf Refinery brought back some memories for us because we initially responded in the morning, all of our personnel for the morning fire, which I believe was 6 alarms. It went under control, I guess, around 11 a.m. We all went home to our homes, some to get some sleep, I guess some to stay up the rest of the day. But when the afternoon incident occurred, and that was the tragedy that really struck the department, we were told to report to our station. And when we got to our station, Fire Communications would call us and said, we're going to send you down to the Gulf Refinery with your apparatus. And we were just getting ready to roll out the door. And at exactly the same time, there was a 2-alarm fire struck up in Kensington at the old Cuneo Press Company. They pulled the second alarm. They called us back and said, nope, don't leave. We might send you on the second alarm at Cuneo Press. And then we were ready to go. And then shortly, a little while later, they called us back, respond to the Gulf. We went to the Gulf Refinery. We only carried 2.5-inch cotton hose line. It was the largest line we carried. We actually emptied our entire hose bed, and we were able to get one gun in service on a tank surrounding to cool it. And it was hard at that time getting a water source because the Gulf Refinery at the time, their hydrants were shut down. So we were able to establish a water source. But once we got our line in service, it was more, we stayed there all night till almost the next afternoon, 2, 3 o'clock. And our job then was to primarily start taking up hose line from other companies. And another one that sticks out to mind when you talk about injured individuals, I guess the one I think was highlighted a lot in the book, Tin Helmets, Iron Men, St. Charles Hotel on Art Street. I believe it was an August night, but it was extremely humid. And besides, the firefighters were really heavily engaged in a search and rescue and removed a lot of occupants, but some of the firefighters themselves became victims, just overcome with sheer heat exhaustion. And we wound up actually helping them carry out actual residents, but also assisting firefighters that were actually quelled by the heat on the outside.
Right. Tom, was your father on during the Gulf Refinery at that time?
No, he had retired already from the reserves due to heart condition. Yeah.
Well, I know you were active and did a lot of following of the city. Do you remember that day, the Gulf, and did you happen to just squeeze down and go down to the fire ground and see the reserve?
No.
Anybody, the guys that you knew down there?
No, I never made it down there. In fact, it was I was on a week's vacation. Just started work. I had a year in where I was working, and we were down the shore, but I followed that all day that morning, from what television would broadcast at that time. Okay. And stayed pretty close to it. I mean, I can remember, very, very tragic. And then hearing the excerpts from your last program about that. Yeah.
Chief, do you, what was the rank structure or the chain of command at the fire reserves? Was it almost mirrored to how it is here in the fire department?
Yes, it was very close. Of course, as Tom mentioned, everybody knew Chief Proudman. He was really, when you thought about the reserves, you knew who Chief Proudman was. And of course, they had an assistant chief, and then they went right down the line with the deputy chief and captains and lieutenant. And I was fortunate enough, just before I left to join the police department, I was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. Again, it was, I look back at that time, it was a great time in my life. It taught me a lot of discipline that I think helped me when I got in the police department. It's that I call it professional courtesy. And it's just a real vivid time. And there's still a few reserves left, and we still once in a while talk on the phone. But it was really a time in my life I'll never forget.
Did the reserve influence you or help you sway the other way to working with the Philadelphia Police Department, or were you tempted to come onto the fire side? Or?
Well, it's funny, Brian. Yes, everybody says, they see me now at the second alarms. He goes, "Why didn't you become a fireman?" I said, "Well, I tried. I took 2 tests, the police and fire, within months of each other. And in the fire department at the time, you had a lot of long tenured firefighters. They weren't retiring after 20 years or 30 years. They were actually veterans that did 40 years plus. And in the police department at the time, there was a lot of turnover in their department, people retiring. And another factor, I think, was right after the Vietnam War ended in 1973. So when you took a test, any civil service test, you got 10 points because you were a veteran. Well, I wasn't a veteran. So the firefighters, there wasn't a big turnover at that time. And I think they maybe hired maybe 1 or 2 classes off the list, where the police department, I think they did 7 or 8 classes. So they got to me pretty quick. But once I got on the job and on the police department, my heart still remained in the fire department. The police department was my occupation. Well, my heart was with the fire service, and I had a lot of firefighter friends. Even in the district where I was assigned at in South Philly, I was always routinely stop at the firehouse, whether to use the toilet facilities or even eat dinner with them.
Right. That you know of, either one of you can answer this, but I'll pose it to you first, Chief. How many people do you think were on the rolls with the fire reserve, and what do you think the percentage of those left the fire reserve and came on the fire department?
Well, again, when I came in, if my memory is correct, I think it was about maybe 25 to 30 people in the reserves when I got in. And the only two that I knew, Chief Marcusella, which I did not meet until later years of life, and I realized he was in the reserves, and we do recall some vivid memories, but Charlie Klink was there. So they're the only two I can remember that went on to the fire service and actually rose up to the rank of chief.
Tom, what about you? Do you know about any of the numbers total of the fire reserve, and how many of those guys that you grew up watching, mentoring to you, that you knew left the fire reserve and came on to the fire department?
Excuse me. I remember two individuals, and Greg's right on target there. Only 20, 25 guys that were pretty active. And the two guys that I remember from when I was a kid that were great guys were John Mills and Kenny Hudson. And they both went on to career jobs. John Mills went to the Navy Yard firefighting, fire department. And Kenny Hudson is somewhere in Pennsylvania. Greg probably might know where it is.
Yeah, he just recently retired. He was out in Lancaster. He was a hazmat officer out there, and he just recently retired, and we still communicate via email. Ken's still out there yet.
Okay, how about that? Yeah, and yeah, a lot of like I say, a lot of good memories, and you know, they were all good guys, and you know what? They took me under their wing as a kid, which gave me a as Greg would say, good thing on discipline, professionalism, and it carried well for me, you know, in the fire department here in Jersey. And Brian, in answer to a question that you had asked earlier, I looked it up here, and the training for the reserves, at least for my dad when he went on, was Tuesdays and Thursday nights at 7:15 p.m. for 7 weeks. That was their training. And I'm looking at in the letter that was sent to him prior to him going on. So that's answers that question for you. I have 7:15 and close at 9:15.
Tom, you're right. I remember there was a large blue training manual, like a dark blue cover.
Yes.
I believe it was the same training manual that was used by our firefighters in the academy.
Yeah.
You kind of mirrored that book, you know. Yeah. You're right. Rope, a lot of rope tie-in, you know, because many times they would take equipment to the roof. We would have to make that knot. And I was never a Cub Scout, so I didn't really know my knots too well.
Chief, could you talk a little bit about what actually led to the disbandment of Engine 81 in the reserves?
So, Brian, I think, again, I think it was at the time during the 70s, I believe the department was trying to hire more firefighters, you know, and as anyone else, like labor negotiations are hard with cities, budget constraints. And it got to be the point where there was some negotiations, and I think the city would actually use us as a negotiating tool. So why do you need these firemen? You have reserve firemen that are assisting you in a lot of these fireground situations. And I remember at one time our primary mission was to respond on the second alarm. And then whether this was a bargaining tool, they actually said, okay, we'll push the reserves back. You can't respond now to the third alarm. And that went into effect. And at this time now I'm in the police department, but I followed, you know, some of the members were there. And then I think what broke the camel's back as far as reserves was that they moved us out of our station at Howard and Columbia. And I believe that became a private real estate venture. I'm not sure. And then they moved us into the new Engine 28 quarters. But the catch was you didn't have no room to bring your apparatus. And at the time when I was there, we had a pumper and we had a medium duty, heavy duty rescue. It was actually run by the Office of Emergency Preparedness. So both vehicles were taken back by the city. The reserves went to Belgrade and Ontario Engine 28 station. And here we lost a station, and they actually put them in the back of the station in a boiler room facility. And they were allowed to bring a desk, a chair, and I think a couple filing cabinets, because I went to visit them, and that was it. So they lost all their apparatus, and they lost really an entire station. I think at that point, members just started to move on to other parts of their life, and it got to the point, I believe it was 1983, when the city officially disbanded the reserve fire force, and it basically came off the books.
Tom, do you remember that time when they disbanded, and how anybody that you knew that might have affected?
I really didn't know if when I remember when they disbanded, it was kind of a sad ending to a piece of history for the fire department. And I didn't, like I said, I didn't know who was on at the actual time. Maybe it was still on from when I was a kid. Probably a lot of those guys had, left, retired, whatever. But I know one thing I recall as far as back then. I remember the night. I can't remember how many alarms it was, but it was at 13th and Pike. It was a lumber yard, and engine 59's pumper was destroyed that night. And the fix-all for that real quick was take 81's piece. So that went to engine 59 now. And when they got it back, I can remember there was a lot of tears being shed because it really saw some work at 59s. There's no doubt about it. And I don't know how much longer it lasted after that. Maybe that's when they got the Mac, I guess, when Greg came in, because 59s, they gave it a good workout for the old gal she was.
Well, Tom, since I'm still on you, you want to talk about a little bit about how that exposure. Also, your grandfather was a member of the Philadelphia Fire Department, so being around those two individuals, your grandfather was at 52s,
Yeah.
riding with the reserve when you could, how that inspired you to become a fireman and then rise into the ranks of chief.
Yeah, that was a great, just a great experience all around growing up, because the stories and the questions I would ask my grandfather. I mean, he went on in 1926 and was first assigned to one of the high pressure companies at on 4th Street above Girard, but engine 29 and truck 7, ladder 7 nowadays. But the questions and stuff and stories he would tell me, and really helped a lot. And then being exposed to the reserves and help, being there for different training nights and whatnot. I just knew what I wanted to do, growing up from day one. And I was able to fulfill that mission. And it was, just a great piece of history and a lot of good memories. And my uncle was on also in the department, my grandmother's brother. I never knew him. He passed away before I was born. But as far as my father and grandfather, the education I got from them was priceless, as far as learning how to be a leader, and keeping calm and everything else, especially on the fire ground, because that's what I learned growing up, and it really helped my career.
Chief, I pose the same question to you. Yeah, I have to agree with Tom. I think, again, it molded me to what I am today. I joined the police department, but I knew that my heart was in the fire service. And then, eventually I kind of teetered a little bit. What do I do at this point? And then, of course, in the 90s, they reached out and I became a member of the Second Alarmers, which is really, I think for me, it's a kind of highlight. If I'm going to end my life at some point, it was just a great thing giving back to the same people that I admired as a kid, firefighters and police. You know, we're actually serving them out there now. And you got to have that volunteerism is, you know, it has to be instilled in you. And I think that was a good portion of my early childhood, that volunteerism spirit remains. So, I mean, I still enjoy that today. I enjoy volunteering and giving many hours back. I mean, it's just, it's a good feeling at the end of the day that you did something to help out the cause.
Well, I want to thank both of my guests today. Thank you for your service, for volunteering and helping us, Chief, especially on the fire ground with Second Alarmers. And this is more content that we like to keep bringing to our viewers. So please, if you haven't, subscribe, like, and leave us a comment. Tell us more content that you would like to see on this channel. I'm going to leave you with a valuable quote from Ben Franklin. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. So harper on that. Until next time, stay safe. Thank you, guys.